Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out Intel's most affordable 4-core 8-thread desktop CPU that they've ever offered, the Core i3-10100. Now this thing, well, it has a tray price of $122 US, but it is currently retailing for $155 or $240 over here in Australia. That should place it in direct competition with AMD's Ryzen 3 3300X, which has an MSRP of $122 US, though it is currently listed over at newegg.com for $130, and worse still, it's out of stock. That said, the 3300X is available locally here in Australia for $205, and that makes the AMD alternative about 15% cheaper. Though admittedly, pricing right now is a bit all over the place. I'm not going to focus on that too much right now. I'll touch on it again towards the end of the video. For now, I expect, or at least hope, once things start to return to normal, they'll both be available for around $120 US. So we'll just have to wait and see how that pans out. In the meantime, I think we should probably talk a bit more about the Core i3-10100, discuss the specifications and how we plan on testing it. So, compared to the previous Core i3 range, let's say the 9100, because that's basically what this chip is replacing or upgrading from. So the 10100 has the same 3.6 GHz base clock, but the max turbo frequency has been increased by 100 MHz to 4.3 GHz. The biggest difference though being the inclusion of hyperthreading support, and that allows the 10100 to support 8 threads, whereas previous Core i3 models were limited to just 4. So in terms of specs, the Core i3-10100 is very similar to 2017's Core i7-7700, which of course cost more than twice as much at just over $330 US. When compared to the i7-7700, the 10100 does have less L3 cache with just 6 MB, though the 10300, which costs just $20 more, gets an 8 MB capacity. Finally, the same Intel UHD graphics 630 is being used, and we're looking at a 65-watt TDP rating. Speaking of the TDP, when I reviewed the Core i5-10400 last week, we did so without any power limits in place, as only ASUS enforces those limits. This upset a few people who claimed this wouldn't be indicative of performance on B and H series boards, and fair enough I suppose, this is something I really should have touched on. And as it turns out, it's not actually the case. The 10400 will deliver the exact same results on all H410 and B460 boards to what we showed on the Z490 board. And this actually isn't because most of the H410 and B460 boards don't adhere to the base Intel spec, rather it's because the 10400 doesn't actually exceed its TDP rating. Under heavy AVX workloads, you're looking at a packaged TDP of just 64 watts, so the 10400 sneaks in there and it won't trip any power limits. So again, just to clarify, power limits enforced or not, the Core i5-10400 will deliver the exact same performance on all H410, B460, and Z490 motherboards. The only performance advantage Z490 motherboards enjoy with these particular processors is seen when memory overclocking. Okay, so with that out of the way, it goes without saying that the Core i3-10100 also comes in under the 65-watt TDP envelope, reaching just 41 watts in an AVX accelerated core heavy workload. Now, that's not to say the CPU is only consuming 41 watts. That's not how the TDP rating works, but I won't get into that here. We've discussed how the Intel and AMD TDPs are defined in the past. The point here being that the motherboard type or quality won't influence performance for these Core i3 and Core i5 parts. However, where it can become a bit of a problem is for the higher end Core i7 and Core i9 models, but that's a video for another day. Getting back to the Core i3-10100, it runs at an all-core clock speed of 4.1 GHz with a max single-core frequency of 4.3 GHz. Using the included box cooler, it peaked at just 61 degrees in our blender stress test, and it ran reasonably quiet, it has to be said. But I would like to note that comparing the operating temperature of the 10100 to something like the Ryzen 3 3300X, for example, it's a bit of a pointless exercise. You're best off just looking at the power consumption, and this is because temperatures can very easily end up being an apples to oranges comparison. For example, where the temperature probe is located in the CPU can heavily influence the reading. A good example of this can be seen when looking at AMD GPUs, which include a hotspot, which is generally more centrally located, and then an edge temperature, which is often much lower. Still, for those of you not satisfied with that, the Ryzen 3 3300X using the Wraith Stealth box cooler reached 75 degrees under the same test conditions, while the R3 3100 reached 65 degrees. Once again, the Ryzen processors were tested on the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master, while the 8th and 9th gen Intel Core processors were tested on the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra, and then the new 10th gen Intel Core processors on the Asus ROG Maximus 12 Extreme. But please note, I've also tested the Core i5-10400 and Core i3-10100 on some B460 motherboards, and found the performance to be identical to that of the Z490 motherboard using DDR4 2666 memory. Finally, all configurations were tested with a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti graphics card, 32GB of DDR4 3200CL14 memory, and a Corsair Hydro Series H150i Pro 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler. Okay, let's get into the results. First up, we have the Cinebench R20 multi-core results, and here the 10100 managed to produce a score of 2,172 points, which is a substantial 37% performance uplift from the 9100F. That said, the results overall are pretty much what we're expecting to see. The 10100's all-core clock frequency is 7% lower than that of the 7700K, so unsurprisingly it was 7% slower. Also contributing to that performance deficit is no doubt the smaller L3 cache, which has been reduced by 2 MB. We also see that the Ryzen 3 3300X was 20% faster in this test, and that suggests for core-heavy workloads, the Ryzen processor is going to be quite a bit faster. As for single-core performance, the 10100 is decent, and while certainly not particularly strong relative to the competition, these are the results you'd expect to see from an Intel processor capped at 4.3 GHz. Moving on to 7-zip, and here we see that the compression results look quite similar to the margins seen in the Cinebench R20 multi-core test. The 10100 provides a really nice step forward from the 9100F, but at 20% slower than the 3300X, it's heavily outgunned in this test. We're also looking at a further 5% decline in performance when using the slower DDR4 2666 memory. Moving over to the decompression performance, and here we see similar results for the 10100 using either DDR4 2666 or 3200 memory. And again, while we do see up to a 41% performance improvement over the previous generation Core i3s, which is obviously great news, AMD's recently released Ryzen 3 3300X is still almost 30% faster, which isn't particularly great news for Intel. Here's a look at AES 256 multi-thread performance. To encrypt or decrypt a file using the AES algorithm, the file must undergo a set of complex computational steps, which can be sped up dramatically using multi-core processors. That said, the 10100 isn't a great deal faster than the 9100F in the Sysoft Sandra benchmark, despite its hyper-threading support, and as a result, the 3300X is up to 45% faster. Where the 10100 buries the 9100F is in the Blender Open Data benchmark. Here the newer Intel processor was 40% faster. That's a great result, and overall performance is reasonably good, despite the 10100 coming in near the bottom of our graph. The 3300X was still 17% faster, which is quite a significant margin, but we have seen larger margins in some of the other tests, so this is one of the more competitive results. And again, we're seeing impressive performance gains from the Core i3-10100 over the 9100F, this time improving performance in the V-Ray benchmark by a 33% margin. So that's great to see, but again, that improvement is quickly overshadowed by the fact that the 3300X is still over 20% faster, this time offering 23% better performance. This time the Ryzen 3 3300X was just 11% faster in the Corona benchmark, so one of the better showings for Intel in our productivity benchmarks. We're also looking at an insane 56% performance uplift over the 9100F, so it would seem as though Intel's hyper-threading technology is very well utilized in this benchmark. Here's a look at code compilation performance, and this time we're looking at a 37% performance improvement for the Core i3-10100 over the 9100F. But as impressive as that improvement is, the 3300X was still 24% faster. The 10100 managed to edge ahead of the 7700K in the DaVinci Resolve Studio 16 benchmark, though we are only talking about a 1% variation in score here, which is within the margin of error. Still, despite that strong result relative to past Intel processors, the R3-3100 was 3% faster, and the 3300X was a more convincing 7% faster. Certainly not huge margins, but we are seeing a continuing trend where the Ryzen 3 processors win the productivity benchmarks. This time we're looking at Core i5 9400F Lite performance in the Adobe Premiere Pro benchmark, and that meant the R3-3100 was 6% faster while the 3300X was 18% faster. The 10100 performs quite well in the Adobe Photoshop benchmark, matching the Ryzen 3 3100 and coming in just behind the Core i7 7700K. Surprisingly though, the 3300X was still 17% faster. And here we have the last application benchmark, Adobe After Effects, and here the 10100 was slightly slower than the R3 3100 and 3300X, so pretty competitive performance in this test. When it comes to power consumption, we see that the 10100 uses slightly less power than the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X, though it is worth remembering that the 3300X was 17% faster in this test, so performance per watt still goes in AMD's favour. Still, it has to be said, when we're talking about total system consumption of under 150 watts for a desktop PC, it really doesn't matter too much. Now it's time for the gaming benchmarks, and first up we have Battlefield 5 at 1080p with the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. Now, I'm not going to explain why we're using a $1,000 plus graphics card to test the gaming performance of budget CPUs. We've explained why this is in the past, so you can look up that content if you're interested. And for those of you who know the reason but don't believe in testing CPUs without a strong GPU bottleneck, well, good luck to you. This is how we and all other credible tech media test CPU gaming performance, and that's never going to change. As separate featured type content, we do look at the relationship between GPUs and CPUs with scaling benchmarks, but that's not an appropriate test for a CPU review. So moving on then, the 10100 is able to roughly match the 7700K when paired with DDR4 3200 memory, and that meant while it was just 2% slower than the 3300X when comparing average frame rates, the 1% low performance was still 12% lower. Still, performance overall was very good, and a massive improvement over the 9100F, which provides inconsistent performance in this title. Interestingly, increasing the resolution, which can increase CPU load in games, sees the 10100 fall behind the 3300X by a 19% margin when comparing 1% low performance. So despite both being 4-core, 8-thread processors, the 3300X does manage to deliver the more consistent experience in Battlefield 5, and that's likely a result of featuring well over twice as much L3 cache. Next up we have Far Cry New Dawn, and starting with the 1080p data, we see that the 10100 is slightly slower than the 3300X when using DDR4 3200 memory. Though again, it's the 1% lows that suffer the most, and here the 3300X was 15% faster. Meanwhile, the faster 3200 memory boosted the average frame rate by 7%, but only improved the 1% low figure by just 3%. Moving to 1440p, and now the 10100 is only able to match the 9100F. Both operate at similar clock speeds, and we have seen some instances where hyperthreading can hamper gaming performance. That said, the 7700K was 16% faster in comparing the average frame rate, and in that comparison, I believe the smaller L3 cache capacity is largely to blame. Moving on to the Gears Tactics results, and again we find the 10100 is quite a bit slower than the 7700K. In fact, here it's only able to roughly match the 9100F, though the 1% low performance is 10% better. But even so, here we're looking at a gaming performance example where the 3300X is 16% faster. Of course, that margin is heavily reduced at 1440p, and now the 3300X is just a few frames faster, but still, not a good result for the 10100. The margins seen in Rainbow Six Siege don't paint a particularly nice picture for the 10100 either. Here the 3300X was 21% faster when comparing the 1% low data. Granted, the Core i3 processor managed over 160 FPS at all times, so the margins might be somewhat irrelevant, but still, this is another game where the similarly priced Ryzen processor is actually faster. Even at 1440p, the 3300X was still 7% faster in comparing the 1% low data, and again, while you probably won't be able to notice that difference, it is still shocking to see Intel at a disadvantage when it comes to gaming performance. Ghost Recon Breakpoint isn't a particularly CPU demanding title, and here the 10100 had no trouble matching the 3300X to come in just behind the higher end, more expensive processors. That being the case, we see even similar margins at 1440p, and here the 10100 was able to deliver the same gaming experience as the 10600K. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a very CPU demanding title, especially where we test, and here the Core i3-10100F and its 4 threads simply aren't enough for smooth frame rates. The addition of hyperthreading saw the 10100 deliver up to 61% better 1% low performance, allowing it to match the Ryzen 5 1600. That said, the Ryzen 3 3300X was still 17% faster, averaging 102 FPS. And the 10100 still trailed the 3300X even at 1440p. Here the Ryzen processor was 9% faster when comparing the DDR4 3200 configurations. Last up we have Red Dead Redemption 2, and here we're looking at pretty subpar performance for the Core i3-10100 when compared to the Ryzen 3 3300X. In this example, the Ryzen processor was up to 15% faster. And even at 1440p, the 10100 trails parts like the Ryzen 3 3300X, albeit by a small margin, and with frame rates above 60 FPS with the DDR4 3200 memory configuration, the gaming experience is still very acceptable. Finally, here's a look at the average frame rate performance across the 7 games tested, and on average, the Core i3-10100 was just 5% slower than the Ryzen 3 3300X. And typically we deem anything within a 5% margin to be a draw. That said, the 3300X did display more consistent gaming performance, and we see that when looking at the 1% low performance, which was 11% lower with the Core i3-10100. The faster memory doesn't make a huge difference for the Core i3 processor, though we are looking at a 6% improvement for the 1% low. And finally, when looking at the DDR4 3200 configuration, we see that the 10100 is comparable to the Core i5-9400F, which isn't unexpected, nor is the fact that it was 6% slower than the 7700K on average. Now, the last series of testing that I conducted with the Core i3-10100 was actually carried out on the MSI B460 mortar, but I'm not going to bother showing all those graphs, B460 versus Z490. Not much point, you've really already seen the results because this board performs exactly the same as the Z490 motherboard when using DDR4 2666. So the DDR4 2666 configuration that you just saw is the same performance you'll get with this CPU on this motherboard. And as noted earlier, this board in no way limits the performance of the Core i3-10100, and the same is also true for the Core i5-10400. In fact, I've even stuck the 10600K, the 10700K, and even the 10900K on this board, and the performance is not limited. The 10900K will run at 4.8 GHz for the all-core on this very motherboard, so very impressive stuff. As for motherboards that adhere to the TDP limits, whether that's 65 watts or 125 watts, it doesn't really matter because if they're adhering to the power limits, doesn't matter if they can deliver much more power than that, they will be limiting the power to run within that base spec. And boards that are doing that, you probably will start to see some power throttling with maybe the 10500 because the 10400 was right on the edge as we saw, but the performance impact is going to be very minimal. It's not until you start getting maybe up to like the 10700K that will start to wind the performance back down. And we saw in our day one review the difference between running within the TDP limits and then no power limits at all with the 10900K. For gaming, really no impact there, not a big deal. Games don't use 10 cores, for example, but for applications like Blender, there is some performance hit. So you can go back and have a look at the 10900K review if you're interested in that. You probably won't see a harsh decline in all-core performance on TDP limited boards until you reach or go beyond the Core i5-10600K. The 10600K, for example, will see the package TDP go as high as 110 watts, and really you probably won't see a harsh decline in all-core performance on TDP limited boards until you go beyond the Core i7-10700K. But in the case of the MSI B460 mortar, this board has a 255 watt sustained boost limit. So even with a Core i9-10900, the board will run without power limits, maintaining an all-core frequency of 4.8 GHz, which I have to say is extremely impressive. Though having said that, I am yet to properly measure the VRM thermals. Anyway, let's move on from the power limits. A comment that I saw pop up numerous times on the 10400 review claimed that reviewers need to use a box cooler when benchmarking. But that's not really necessary because the 10400 and 10100 are by no means thermally limited by the Intel box cooler. Performance will be identical whether you use the box cooler or the absolute most exotic liquid cooling setup you can think of. So to reiterate, we're not thermally limited with the box cooler, and it's not going to make any difference to the benchmarks. Unless, of course, those benchmarks are looking at operating temperatures, and then, of course, that's a whole different story. As for the Core i3-10100, what do we make of this thing? Well, for this conclusion, I'm just going to assume for now that this thing's coming in at $120 US, the same price as the 3300X, though we do have some evidence that I will review right towards the end of the video that indicate that maybe that's not the case. But let's go with the cost being equal just for now. Which one should you buy? In terms of gaming performance, they're pretty similar. The 10100 seems to have an advantage in less demanding titles, whereas the 3300X showed solid gains in games such as Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example. And that to me would suggest moving forward it may be the better gaming CPU, but at least for now they trade blows. The problem for the 10100 comes when looking at productivity performance, and I know some Intel fans will claim that no one does any real work with Core i3 processors, or any budget processor for that matter, but that's simply not true. The list of people who would want a cheap but effective CPU for productivity tasks is almost endless. Engineering students, amateur content creators, programmers, and like I said, the list just does go on. So for these people with a little over $100 to spend, the Ryzen 3 3300X is just far more appealing, often offering at least 20% better performance. When it comes to general performance, web browsing, emails, Word documents, and all that sort of stuff, really doesn't matter. Either CPU really will crush those tasks, though an advantage the Core i3-10100 has for those users is its integrated GPU. So if you only require weak GPU performance, then the 10100 makes sense and can be a more cost-effective option. But this obviously doesn't apply to most productivity tasks, and it certainly doesn't apply to those wanting to do any gaming. As for the other costs associated, such as the motherboard, the MSI B460 mortar should come in at about the same price as the B450 Tomahawk, but of course that will limit you to DDR4 2666 memory, which does make the 10100 a little bit slower. So as I said in my Core i5-10400 review, for Intel to be truly competitive at these lower price points, they really need to open up memory overclocking on the B and H series motherboards. In conclusion, I don't think the Core i3-10100 is a bad product. It's certainly a massive step up from the previous 9th generation Core i3s, but it does have to contend with the Ryzen 3 3300X. That's a bit of a problem. The Ryzen CPU is just as fast for gaming as we saw, application performance is excellent, and it can also be overclocked for even better results. And that's something we obviously didn't explore in this content. And it also supports higher frequency memory on affordable B450 motherboards. And finally, all indications point to the 3300X as being the slightly cheaper CPU. Again, I don't want to focus on that too much because out of stock, pricing issues at the moment, but it looks like it may be around $20 cheaper. Again, we'll have to wait and see in a few months' time. Here in Australia, though, we do have some concrete evidence of that, so both parts are in stock. PC Case Gear, for example, lists the Core i3-10100 at $230 Australian, and then the Ryzen 3 3300X at $205. So the Intel processor, I don't think it's worth the 12% premium, and I guess that's where I'll leave this review at. Of course, you guys can let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll review all those comments, and maybe we can do a reply in the comments episode for this review, depending on how things go. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. If you liked the video, you know what to do. If you'd like to get more involved with the channel, become part of our Discord community, watch our live streams, Q&As, and behind the scenes videos, then check out our Patreon account. The link is in the video description. Other than that, all I can really say is thank you very much for watching up until this point. You are a real MVP. And yeah, I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.